Trauma can come in all shapes and sizes. It doesn't discriminate between the old and the young, the rich and the poor, the black and the white. We all have experienced trauma in some form or another. And if you're listening to this right now, guess what? I have some very good news for you. Whatever that trauma is that happened to you, you survived. You're still here, and that makes you incredibly strong and resilient. Today's guest is Andi Golusky, the Executive Director of NRV Cares and the Chair of the newly established New River Valley Resiliency Network. While each of us more than likely has trauma in our past, that trauma can still get triggered in our present. And Andi is on a mission to help communities step up and become more trauma-informed so that we as a society can come together and help each other through difficult times. Welcome to Drawn, the podcast that draws you in with stories of hope, healing, and even a little hustle while battling anxiety and depression. Think you have to wait until you've conquered your mental illness to start living a joyful, meaningful life? Think again. Conquering your mental illness is part of living a life you love, and we're going to figure it out together. I'm Katie Rashedko, and this is Drawn. Hey there, Andi. Welcome to the Drawn podcast. I'm so excited that you are here.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here and, just continue to share the knowledge and wisdom regarding the mental health field for sure.
So I'd like to just start by, first of all, opening the floor up to you by simply just asking you what it is that you do, what's your background in, and how do you help people in your job?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a licensed clinical social worker, and prior to taking on the role I have now at NRV Cares, I worked with children and families who had significant behavioral, mental health, behavioral health, and emotional health issues, as well as working with folks who had substance use disorders as well. So I worked very intensely in community-based services, providing kind of wraparound therapies. And I did that for close to 10 and a half years and loved it, really enjoyed the work. Extremely fulfilling, but I wanted to kind of pull back and, in the world of social work, there's so much to do and there's so much that can be done, and found, instead of kind of being on the treatment end, what would the prevention end look like? And so that's kind of where my step led me to NRV Cares, which is, we are a child abuse prevention agency. And so I really enjoy kind of being on the front end this time because, unfortunately, I worked with so many kids who experienced unheard of traumas. And, now in the role I'm in now, the hope is that we can provide education and information to parents and caregivers and to the community to keep these kids from experiencing those things, So it's just a really neat place to be put in now. But of course, there's still a lot that we do with folks who do have mental health issues,
Right, absolutely. So I'd love to really focus our interview today on trauma. I think a lot of people have an idea as to what trauma is, or they might be able to tell you what they consider an incident of trauma is. But from kind of more of the professional, scientific, medical perspective, how do you describe trauma?
For me, a trauma is anything that someone experiences that kind of has a lasting impact on them, and usually it's affecting their brain. And, and unfortunately, that's not something we can actually always see on the outside. Some people are in a car accident, that's an intense trauma, and they may have physical scars from that. Other people may experience the loss of a loved one, and that's a huge trauma for them, but that's not going to show anything on the outside. And so, that's kind of what we look at as far as, what trauma is. It's very kind of personal from person to person. But lots of times what we now know of trauma is the impact it has on the brain. And for lots of people, certain smells, certain, images, certain things can bring back a trauma, reaction, a trauma memory that then can kind of, put people in a not so great spot, and then that kind of creates some, difficulties for folks.
Interesting. So you were in kind of what you said was the almost reactive responsive care of trauma for about 10.5 years. So in those 10 years, how did, I guess, trauma change in just a decade? Because I feel like mental health in the industry is changing so quickly. Did you notice at all how much time or research or new things were being found and discovered about trauma's effect on the brain just in your short time, being a part of that
Yeah,
world?
absolutely. I think that's a great way to say it. As I progressed into the field, more and more attention was being placed on the necessity to educate everyone about trauma and its impact on the brain, on our children, on us as adults, and so that's kind of became this movement of a trauma-informed kind of communities. And so it was really important for when I worked at NRVCS. That was one of the first community service boards in Virginia, I believe, to really take on those trauma-informed initiatives. So from the person who would clean at night to the executive director, everyone who worked at New River Valley Community Services was going to be trauma-informed, because the idea was you never know who you're going to come across that needs you to be able to respond to them in that fashion. And so that's an initiative they've taken on. And so the kind of the idea with the whole trauma-informed community is, we want everyone to take this initiative on of educating staff for, for their organization, for their clients, for our community members about what does it mean to be trauma-informed and how can you become a trauma-informed agency.
I really like this concept of trauma informed community, and it's a new term that you introduced to me really when we did an interview for the TV station not that long ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I like this idea because it kind of gives this sense of responsibility to the whole community to help everyone within the community. Because, like you said, mental health issues are often unseen. They've got those invisible scars and stuff, and you never know what past somebody is bringing with them wherever they go. And so to have a trauma informed community just seems so beautiful to me that it's kind of crazy that it's not more common or it's not more popular or that it's not been around forever and ever. It's really almost new in the sense that research is being done to help people from all walks of life understand trauma rather than it just being kind of a medical term.
Absolutely. And I think, as we talked before, unfortunately, mental health has the stigma, and I think that's all been part of it, because often when we look back at folks who have some mental health stuff, often when folks have substance use disorders, when folks have, pretty profound issues that they're dealing with, as we found heart disease, obesity, when we go all the way back, one common denominator often is trauma. And so, that's where I think a lot of people can say, oh yeah, because I get that now. I can relate. I can see that from these other people, from what they experienced or what personally other people experience. And then, right now for us, as a network trying to, become more established, the pandemic hit, and this was, I think now, this is a point that a lot of people can identify of, yeah, okay, like I do feel like this is a trauma that I've been through, and it truly is for our kids and adults alike. So I think that more than ever, we need to kind of come together as a community and just support each other and be asking this question of, what happened to you, not what's wrong with you. That concept I think is just, if we all could keep that in mind, I think we're going to make for a much better community.
Oh, absolutely. I remember doing a story for my job at the TV station last summer, so the pandemic is kind of just starting to kind of get into full swing, and we're starting to realize that this might not be going away as quickly as we thought. And I remember doing an interview with someone who was talking about the trauma comparison of the pandemic to 9/11, and how a lot of the fear and the uncertainty and the scariness and seeing something that they'd never really seen before, put on TV and watched over and over and over again, that had a very similar effect back in 2001 that we're seeing in a lot of people now. And yet, with the education and the science and the data that we have now about mental health and the less stigma surrounding mental health, we're better equipped to help people kind of deal with this new collective trauma, and also how the trauma affects individuals, on that individual basis. So I think the pandemic has done this really interesting thing where it's been horrible in so many ways, and yes, traumatic, but because of that, it shed a light on trauma and its effect on mental health in a way that might not ever have happened before, because now we're talking about it because we're relating to it and relating to each other in that way, because we have this like huge unifying factor that we've all been through.
I completely agree. I think, social isolation in itself has now become so much more understood since so many people had to become more isolated, And so, I think now people are really starting to empathize with their elders who are, oftentimes alone, even prior to the pandemic, and really understand where other folks are coming from. So I think you're exactly right, Katie.
Yeah, and empathy. I mean, you hit on that word to me is so powerful, because in a lot of ways I think people might agree that we've gotten away from empathy in a lot of our everyday lives, especially pre-pandemic. Everyone just kind of feels what they're feeling and they don't take the time to necessarily try and understand other people, or we're just all really busy, and we totally get that. But empathy is something that we really need to be able to capture again. And I think the pandemic has helped us in a lot of ways understand empathy and empathize with people that we might not have otherwise empathized with, because now we have this collective emotion or this collective trauma. So I'm kind of curious, is what role does empathy play in helping build a trauma-informed community?
I think it's significant. I think it's really helping people understand what is empathy. And, that's a lot of asking that question, what happened to you, and kind of just being there, I think that's a part of, that trauma, creating that trauma-informed community, so part of that is getting trainings, and that's something that NRVCS is doing. They do them free to different organizations, schools, all of that, to really just kind of get everyone speaking the same language around this, because that's another piece. If we can all have the same understanding, the same language about trauma, and how we can, kind of build that resiliency, then we're going to have much better success and efforts around our community, So that's, I think, a big thing. And so far, I think we're pretty successful. I mean, this has been years in the making, but most of all, every school system has received this to some extent, So I think it's really getting it out, and that's where I really like the Resiliency Network at this point. It's getting it out to the broader community, the businesses, the other organizations that aren't always talking about trauma, that aren't always aware of, like, these kinds of concepts. It's not in their everyday vernacular like it is mine, and really get them to understand, oh, wait, I still work with people, I'm still working with human beings on the other side of, these numbers, or on the other side of this contract, and that there's got to be that understanding that, we got to take this kind of human approach to them. And so, I think I truly love living in the New River Valley, and I think one of my favorite aspects of it is that we already work so well together as a community, and balancing out of the needs of the community. And so I think the Resiliency Network just makes sense. It's just a continued effort to just keep making our community a better place for everyone.
Yeah, and I don't know if you were here during the Virginia Tech shooting. I wasn't, but in the years that I've worked here and worked in the New River Valley, worked with Virginia Tech, worked with people who were there, that's exactly what they say, is that the New River Valley isn't just one county, it's not just two counties, it's really this very organic collective network that really came together in a response to the Virginia Tech shooting. And because of that, again, that collective trauma that the whole community went through, out of that has really sprung this big sense of community that is very unique to the region of Virginia. As a reporter, I cover Southwest Virginia, so I cover a whole bunch of different areas, but there is nothing quite like New River Valley. And so I'm kind of curious, in your mind, like, do you think that Virginia Tech really did play a major role in bringing you all together?
I think that's a good point. I was here, but I was fresh out of college. So to know what it was like prior, but I've kind of heard the same thing, Katie, from my peers in the field who were around during all of those efforts, and how much as a community we've continued to grow and kind of work together towards that. So it's not competitive. It's not, our police force is better than yours. It's, let's all work together and have the best of the best in this region, and so I really think that regional effort got strengthened by what happened on 416. And that's what that's kind of what, different police agencies have expressed as well, is that they had to call in everyone then, and everyone was touched by what happened. And so I think that that's a lingering thing that we've been able to learn from and put the systems in place to make things better. And it's worked. They've seen a lot of success from those changes that they were able to implement.
Yeah, and you guys definitely here in the New River Valley have that very unique ability to kind of network among various agencies and jurisdictions and stuff, from the policing and the sheriff's office to, your mental health communities and the health districts and stuff. And it's this very cool organic way in which you guys all communicate together to make sure that the people of the New River Valley get all of the help they need. So it's my hometown too. I love it so much. What I'm curious to ask you now is kind of going back to when we talk about trauma and we define trauma. I think a lot of people have a misconception about trauma having to be, or real trauma being something big, like the Virginia Tech shooting or a global pandemic. And that if they have something that feels uncomfortable in their past, but they haven't quite labeled it as one of those big traumas, then they don't feel like it's okay to call it a traumatic incident. But I'd love to hear from your perspective, to kind of speak against that, because I know that traumas come in all shapes and sizes and is different for everyone.
Absolutely. What one person's experience is going to be completely different from another. And I think that that's where, we've been in this culture of like, dust yourself off. And yes, we want to build resiliency. We want people to kind of bounce back. But, telling someone who, has been born with a fear of dogs to, dust themselves off after they just got bit by a dog is going to be very different than someone who, has grown up loving dogs and has a great experience of them. It is all completely subjective, of that person's kind of background, of their experience, of what their reality and their truth has been their whole life. And so, it is, I think that's where we really just do need to take the judgment out of, when we approach people, and not try to go there and not draw up these opinions, but just being there, and being beside them and not just kind of, yes, but, or at least this didn't happen, because the reality is that person's experience is that person's experience, and if they are affected by it and how they're affected by it does not matter. My opinion is not going to change that, and so instead, I think the biggest thing that we need to take from this is, okay, well, how do we build resiliency then? How can we help each other build resiliency? How can we be a resilient community, So instead of harping on, oh, well, that's not a trauma, or, you're not worthy of, calling that a traumatic incident, or comparing yourself to me because of what I went through. Instead, just all kind of banding together and saying, okay, well, what do we need to move on? What do we need to help you get through this? And that needs, I think, to be our focus.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one small example in my past is that when I was about 18 years old, I was in a car accident where the roads were really, really icy. It had been snowing and my tires hit some black ice and I flipped the car over. Now it's 11 years later, and guess what? I still have a fear of driving in the snow. Like, I'm great riding shotgun, but driving in the snow still gives me that trigger of just like whenever I take a curve like slightly too fast, or if I start to feel my tire skid in any way, I am immediately 18 years old again, living in Germany, flipping my car over, on this mountain pass, just like that. And I think that's really
Yeah.
interesting when I kind of go back and I kind of psychoanalyze, my own traumas and experiences, seeing incidences like that I was fine. My friend who was in the car with me, we were fine. We had no physical injuries whatsoever. Like, in all honesty, it's a really small trauma, and yet the effects of that still linger even to this day. But a lot of people, don't like to admit of a trauma like that, because they don't want it to take away from people who have lost loved ones in a car accident. So they do this like comparison of like, there's only so much trauma in the world, and I don't want to take any of it because there are real people out there who have experienced quote unquote real trauma. And that's not the case. Trauma, it affects all of us, in different ways.
Yeah, and even when you're not totally aware of it, right? Like, so that's what the whole ACE study did, was the adverse childhood experiences, was looking at what were these, ACE scores, what were these traumas that people experienced in the past that's now affecting their physical health. So they don't even really realize it, and then it's like these physical ailments that they're having, and so, yeah, like you said, like when you're now driving and it's bad weather, you may notice some, physical stuff within yourself that you can't even, that you're not even aware of happens. You might tighten up, you might, just have some more panic-like symptoms,
Yeah.
things like that, because that's the reaction in your brain, and that's oftentimes unconscious, people may respond to dates, to times of year, to months, there's all kinds of things that can trigger a traumatic memory, a trauma reaction. And it really can, take people off guard, and so I think that that's when it's hard, because it can be unconscious, and that's how our brain can work, right? Because our brain may be trying to protect us, but that's where then you can get exposed to it, and it's like, whoa, okay, that's right, we've been here and done that, and this doesn't feel good, and that's when your body may respond differently.
Right. So now I'm curious from your perspective. I mean, what can people do when they start to realize that like, hey, this time of year comes around, every October I'm feeling this way. Like I don't know what's going on, or if they do have some kind of traumatic incident that they can pinpoint. I mean, what advice do you have for those people who maybe aren't sure whether or not they need to get help?
I think it's really, pulling back and just like you said, kind of analyzing, was it something that happened this time of year? Is it, this kind of event? And then do I need to kind of process this further and speak to someone, or is it, you're fully aware, you went through something, and that on this date and this week, this is going to be tough for me. And so putting in kind of preventative measures for yourself to kind of help you. So, making sure your support network's around, if you need to take a mental health day off of work, taking that time to be yourself, maybe that's when you're increasing some exercise to increase those endorphins, trying to take those steps to kind of help you build that resiliency. I think too, having that awareness is just helpful in itself. And so, just knowing like, hey, it's going to be a rough week, and those close to you just saying that, I'm probably going to have a tough time. Like this is the tough time for me. So just be aware that if I'm not receptive or if I'm struggling, I'll be okay. I just that's just is what's going on with me. And I think that can be really helpful. And then as a peer, as a friend, as a colleague, hopefully people can be receptive to that.
And that's basically where that trauma-informed community comes from. Like, if we can create
Exactly.
more, better, stronger trauma-informed communities, hopefully people who experience trauma and are dealing with the symptoms of that trauma, they have a safe place where they can share that, hey, they're going through something, or hey, they're not doing okay, and it be received with love and compassion rather than judgment, or maybe just that kind of like, okay, well, too bad, like, you still gotta work, you still gotta do this, suck it up attitude that I think for a lot of the times, especially, generations ago when no one talked about anything that they were dealing with mentally, emotionally, now we can create these communities where that's okay to talk about, and trying to destigmatize the idea of mental health issues.
I completely agree. I mean, I think just thinking about sick days, when we think of sick days, we're never thinking about, typically, we're not thinking about mental health, but the reality is, why aren't we using sick days for mental health? We as a culture, as a society, we exhaust ourselves. We work ourselves ragged. We're a very achieving community, excuse me, culture, and so it gets a lot to be a lot for people. So I think we really need to normalize that sick can be mental, emotional, or physical health. And that we should be able to teach our kids that too. So it's not just, okay, do you have a fever, a sore throat, but if we're having a really bad day mentally, then maybe we need to take the day off or take a time out and regroup and get to a place where we're back at it the next day, and that be okay. And not looked down upon.
Right, exactly. I totally agree. And it's like the whole world feels like it's collapsing in on you. And so to take a break, to have that mental health day, whether it's as a child or, of course, now as an adult, it can be a huge difference.
Yeah, and I think my hope is, and I think generally employers are open to that. It's a very, my hope is that we go to a generic sick day, so no one's having to justify what they're using it for. But I think even going so far as to teaching our kids, that this is okay, to miss school for this kind of thing, that it's acceptable in our culture.
Yeah, so I'm curious for you, when you talk about kids experiencing trauma, I mean, that's a whole different ballgame, because even as adults we can really struggle to find the words to explain or to describe what we're feeling. But with kids, I mean, their vocabulary is even smaller, and their understanding of emotions and what's happening to them can be very small. So how do you work with kids who experience trauma but don't necessarily have, I guess, the words to explain what's going on?
Kids often are kind of communicating those things through their behaviors. And so really lots of times as you're doing, cognitive behavioral therapy and kind of working on those things and really lots of play, just engaging them in those kinds of interactions, are really, how we get to that. And truly it's up to the child. If a child's ready to kind of go through that, then there's, some great therapies, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapies, things like that, provider kids can do and be engaged in. But I think just, truly kids are almost more resilient than adults at times because they're younger and they haven't had, as much of kind of, what life can throw at them, as much. However, what I saw a lot from children who experience traumas, and depending on the severity, it could really have them regress as far as their behaviors and their development. And so, then you're just kind of trying to get them back up to where they need to be. So you're kind of focusing on those things. And then just really, I think, being for kids, one of the number one ways to kind of build resiliency in them is that they have one, positive, loving adult relationship that can make all the difference in the world for a child. And so that's one thing for children who are in the system who experienced abuse and neglect. I think, having these secure adults in their life is vital and so necessary. And so that's a huge way to build the resiliency. But yeah, with kids it is hard. I mean, and it comes to, where they're at, if they're wanting to go, to talk about their trauma, and then it's kind of personal, from there as far as what the treatment plan may look like.
Right, and you said that, it's so important for kids to have that one loving adult, and sometimes that's not an adult who's in the home with them. Sometimes it's not a family member, and instead it's, a church youth group leader, or it's a pastor, or a Sunday school teacher, or a regular academic teacher. And yet here we are in a pandemic where those contacts, they've been cut off from them. And so have you at all noticed or seen a change in trauma in kids who may not have that support network?
So it's been hard to know from the community yet, since kids are just now kind of getting back more into the school. We're not sure, the numbers for abuse and neglect cases did go down, but of course we're not feeling like that's, indicative of what's really going on. We definitely have heard about a lot more kids struggling on the virtual and the lack of social interactions and more of the isolation. I think another struggle is about the kids, like you said, who don't have that caring caregiver at home. And so those kids may not be doing any kind of work and have any eyes on them. And so those are the ones I think we're really worried about. But school systems, kind of have folks in place that are trying to check up on these kids and kind of bring them back in. I know, the guidance departments are really working hard to, ensure that kids have kind of some other resources and support to help them through these, tough times, because it definitely is a struggle, and they're, kids are all over the map, and they're not sure what's going on, and so I think that that in itself is traumatic for them. So, I think for us as providers, it's just more scary of what could be going on out there, and so we're really hopeful as we get to more of a normal that we'll have eyes on the kids, and mandated reporters will be there, and we'll be able to kind of keep kids safe.
Exactly. And
ensure that they get what they need. Sorry.
Yeah, I know, and that it all goes back to what we've been talking about having trauma-informed communities. Like, schools have, people and resources in place to be those trauma-informed networks for these kids, looking out for them and stuff. And now it's a simple matter of neighbors looking out for neighbors, and congregation members looking out for congregation members, and businesses looking out for businesses. So I'd love to just kind of ask you, what is it that people can do to become more trauma informed, and even as an organization, if they run their own businesses or anything like that, what can they do as a company or as a business to make sure that they have an environment that is trauma informed as well?
I would encourage folks to kind of look up how to be a trauma informed organization, and to receive those trainings. So it is kind of getting trained in the basics. Sorry.
No, you're good.
Getting trained getting trained in the basics of trauma, and then what they will need to do from there on, and how to respond to employees and to clients who potentially have trauma backgrounds, and how to communicate and what that all means. So it's really first step is education, and fortunately, with the NRV Resiliency Network, we're hoping to make those opportunities for people more available more frequently, and a free resource, because that's the name of the game, is just getting the word out there, and that's just going to help all of our community members.
Right. So kind of, what would you say your biggest hope is for our community and for communities around the world when it comes to becoming more trauma informed?
I think, I think all of us just really, look at others and provide empathy and grace, and kind of say what's happened to you, not what's wrong with you, and be trauma informed, just spread the education about the immense adverse effects that trauma can have on people, that you don't see, but it's there. And so I think we all need to be more understanding and empathetic towards each other.
Would you say that there's hope that we can actually get to that place as a community?
I think so. I like you said, I think that there's lots of things that divide us at times, but I think that this is one that, as you said, with this pandemic, we've all been able to kind of have a glimpse of, and really feel. And so I think that kind of, hopefully, that feeling will be something people can identify with and maintain that, so that we can all kind of work together to make a resilient community, And so I feel like in the NRV, there's a lot of energy around this, in different groups, and so I'm hopeful that if we just continue to spread the word, that it'll get out there, and truly at that point, if we're educating a couple folks that had never heard of this before, it trickles down. So that's our goal.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Andi, this has been one of the best conversations because it's so informative and it is, like you said, it's so educational. So this is a big step and hopefully informing a lot of our community members about being more trauma informed. If people have any questions or they want to reach out to you to get some more information, how can they do that, whether it's you through the Resiliency Network or even through NRV Cares?
Yeah, I would say email is probably the best way, which is Andi, A-N-D-I, at nrvcares.org. And then feel free to follow us on Facebook for the Resiliency Network and message me there because I also take that on. So
Perfect.
kind of got a little bit of everything down.
A little bit of everything. That is perfect. So thank you so much, Andi. I am so excited to share this with all of our listeners.
Yeah, thanks so much, Katie, for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Drawn Podcast, empowering women battling anxiety, depression, and other mental illnesses. For I believe we've been drawn together to create a life we love. You can find more amazing content at my website, KatieRochetco.com, or follow me on Instagram at The Drawn Collection.